Tēnā tātou. Welcome everyone. I'll just start us off with a karakia, and then we'll get our workshop, our seminar again, our webinar. Nō reira mi noi tātou. Hei mua koe e wau tuhi a mātou mahi katoa. Anei anō tō punungi tuku whakamoemiti tukuni kia koe kia tau ai te manaakitanga te ai o tanga ki runga kia mātou. Hā koe runga ti purangi I tēnei rangi. Toro mai o pākau ki runga ki ngā whānau. E pauri ana, e pōhara ana, e māwiwi ana. I roto ina whare tiaki o te mōtu, me tō tātou wākainga no hoki. Ho mai kia mātou e tēnei wā, e tō mātou atua kia whakamāmātu urahi mo e mātou roto I tēnei au pū mato. No reira I te tīmatanga te kupu ko te atua no te kupu I te tīmatana nāra nei ngā mea katoa I hanga. Ka hore te tahi mea kore tangi I o ngā mea ai te ora te māramatanga mo ngā tangata katoa I te pauri te māramatanga e whitiana. Ia ki hei mau I te pauri, rōri ki tō ingoa tapu, amene. Hoi anō tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou e whakakao nei I runga, aha koe I runga te purangi, e whakakao nei a wairua, ki te whakarongo nei, ki tēnei kaupapa, e kaupapa I mui a tātou I tēnei wā. Tuatahi ka huri ngā whakaaro ki ngā pare kawa o te motu. Tērā tō tātou rangatira, ko au nei ki runga te marae hoani Waititi I tēnei ata. Ko Dave tērā koutou me ngā tēne mate e pīkau nei e koutou, kia whariki nei e mui a mātou, kia tangihia, kia mihihia, kia purapura kia rata katoa. Huri anō nei, kia tātou ngā mahuaitanga tēnā tātou. Tēnā tātou rungi ngā auhuatanga me ngā piki me ngā heke o te wā nei, tatara ki te wā e whakanuia nei te whānautanga o te karaiti nei. He wā whakatā, he wā whakahono nei ki tō tātou whānau. Hoi anō, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Look, just wanted to say welcome everyone. I know you didn't come here to listen to me, that you're waiting to get really into the conversation. And in a perfect world, we'd like to go around the room and sort of introduce ourselves, but by the time we do that, there'll be nothing left to talk about because it'll be time to go. So if you can just pop a bit of a welcome and your name in the chat so we know who's here and we can make some connections a bit later on. But welcome to this this kaupapa. And we've been talking about it for some time now. And I guess future models of governance for the creative sector, but you could take creative out of there and just put anything in substitute. It's just that generally creatives are faster to change than anyone else because we're so used to adapting and running on the smell of an oily rag. So look, I'm not going to hold us up any longer. I just want to pass us over to Alison for us to get into it. But in my mihi, I sort of think, I mihi to those that have gone before us, all those ones that we pay tribute to that actually paved the way for us to be here. And secondly, just in our karakia, I sort of asked for some divine intervention so that the government would come up with an art strategy. No, I didn't say that, I'm just joking. But a national art strategy would be amazing, but that's, I guess we might talk about that later. Okay, hoi anō, I'll pass you over to Alison and we'll get into it. Kia ora tātou.
Ngā mihi Eynon. Mō reina koutou, nau mai haere mai. It's wonderful to welcome you all to join us today. Ko Alison Taylor. I'm the Chief Executive of Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi, the Regional Arts Trust. And we're really delighted to welcome you all today. Just to echo Eynon's mihi to you. This is a really big day for us. This is a conversation we've been wanting to have for a while, and we're delighted that so many of you want to join us in the beginning of a journey, what we hope is the beginning of a journey around exploring what creative governance can look like and should look like in the future. So welcome all of you to this hui this morning. I'm going to do a little bit of hosting and holding a bit of the kōrero up front. We really encourage you both, as Eynon said, to introduce yourselves in the chat, and as we progress also to use the chat as the vehicle for asking questions, sharing thoughts, because that's really helpful for us. And whatever we're not able to answer today, we will follow up and answer later. Just a little bit about Te Taumata, if you don't know us. We are a legacy CCO, so created pre-Super City. We've been around for 20 years. And about 3 years ago, we sort of relaunched the trust with a new strategic direction around how can we really support and enable the sector to come together, to have these important conversations, to think about how we collaborate, how we innovate, how we challenge the system that we've got to make it better. So we're really interested in what leadership and governance in that space looks like. And that's really the context for today's hui. It is the beginning of a series of conversations, and I'll say a bit more about that later. And we are recording this. We won't necessarily release the whole recording. We might edit the highlights. But the idea is for people that couldn't make today can still access the information. We try to share everything that we do. The article that you will have received in advance is live on our website. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I'm sure Kylie will pop it in the chat, and it is on our homepage on the website as well. And I think that's everything I'm meant to do up front. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Caren and Eynon to this first part of the conversation. Eynon, you probably introduced yourself, although you can have another go if you like. And but I'll get Caren to introduce herself, and then we're going to open up a conversation to start to think into this space around creative governance practice. Caren.
Thanks, Alison. Kia ora ana tātou katoa. This morning, as part of my introduction, I'm invoking a theme of things starting with C. So clearly my name, so Caren Rangi, very proud Cook Islands Māori, Canterbury born, though Hawke's Bay raised. These days an independent governance practitioner, which takes some explaining to people, I guess. So I generally say board director, but principally at the moment, chair of Creative New Zealand, Toi Aotearoa, board member for Te Papa and Radio New Zealand, Pacific Home Care Services and Pacifica TV. And just to top off the theme of things starting with C, just tested positive for COVID. So sitting here in an undisclosed hotel room in Auckland, but really pleased to be here with all of you to join and connect in with your thoughts on something that's been exercising us for a while. That's me.
Oh, kia ora tātou. Eynon Delamere. You've had a number of roles in the past in terms of governance. Currently, I'm looking after a couple of marae, so Whānau Waititi up in West Auckland, and also my marae at the centre of the universe, I call it, down in Te Kaha on the east coast there. Yeah, and I can't come up with a letter, Caren. I should have thought of that before you said the C. Or maybe at the end I'll come up with a letter. Kia ora.
Wonderful. And Caren, we're particularly delighted that you're with us when you're not very well. I'm very sorry to hear that you've got COVID again. So I'm going to start by just opening up the floor to the conversation that we want to have. And Caren, if I can ask you to perhaps just dig into why this conversation is important and why having it now is important.
Sure. There's a couple of vantage points at which I'm looking at this from. The first is just in the governance world generally. There's starting to be some really good conversations around, can we govern better and govern differently in a way that's far more fit for purpose for Aotearoa New Zealand. But what goes hand in hand with those conversations is, how do you do that? How do you do that when there's been quite embedded governance practices for a long time? And within a wider environment where generally, you know, the general public doesn't really think about governance until maybe things go wrong. So that's one vantage point. The other is from thinking about, for us in the creative sector, just how often it seems that the creative leadership and the governance leadership in organisations butt up against each other, rather than being able to move together in order to help creative organisations. And there seems to be a whole set of factors as to why that is. But in the course of our conversations with Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi, we one day said, well, what if you, rather than trying to work on the governance all the time, what if we look to what we know about creative practices in the creative sector and see what can we learn from there to help the governance? And so this has been the beginning of a really great conversation. But I'd also say that once we started it, it was a little bit like opening this big Pandora's box. And realizing the number of people who are hanging out to have conversations about the challenges of governance, but there being nowhere to land them. So the fact the space has even been made is fantastic.
Kia ora, Caren. Thank you. Eynon.
Yeah, look, I guess the word governance automatically sends in my mind compliance. And I think we've moved from compliance into leadership, and the word we should be using is leadership. So I'd like to come at it from that perspective, that when we're on not-for-profit boards or arts boards and we don't get paid, we want to make the best of our time. And so that's about showing some leadership and doing things differently. Signing the accounts off once a month and making sure that Alison spends the right amount of money, that's all good and proper. But actually, how can we add value in our position as a leader in this organisation? So I think we need to flip the conversation around into leadership. I think the other thing that would help too is there's a lack of people coming through in this space. One, because I think Caren mentioned it, that actually it's a different paradigm when you're talking governance. You're talking all this weight of responsibility. And now if someone stubs their toe at work, you're liable and all that sort of stuff. So we need to reframe the conversation. I guess the other thing I'd just like to leave with that is that if we do the same as we've been doing for the last 30 years, we're going to get the same. So we actually have to try and make a change, and I think the time is right to make the change. And at the moment, it's sort of sexy and fancy to put a couple of Māoris on your board and say, oh yeah, we're treaty focused and we got all this sort of stuff, but it's not really authentic, and it really doesn't do anything other than make the 4 Māoris that go on all the boards very tired. So yeah, I'd open it up with that, and then I guess that'll draw out a whole lot of conversations as we go forward. Kia ora.
Yeah, hey, Alison, can I pick up just something from there, just from what Eynon said? Because the other vantage point I've been looking at this from is from my own Pacific communities, where there's a big conversation going on with us at the moment about why don't we have more people at board tables? And in fact, what can we bring to board tables, because there's an assumption that we don't know much about governance. And so again, it's that real mixed responsibility of what we can do as our own community to upskill ourselves. But I also have a question as to what boards can be doing to receive people with different views, different models, different approaches.
Yeah, look, those are great questions, I think, that you're asking yourself and of the room. And I guess I'd like to dig into that a bit more. So what are the sorts of things that would start to shift that dial to that focus on leadership as opposed to the sort of more accountability, fiduciary side of governance? What sort of would be the first things that perhaps those of us both working with and on boards should be thinking about to change that conversation? Eynon, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think there's some simple things that we can do. In fact, just by rejigging some agenda items to leave all that compliance stuff right to the end of the meeting, so that you can do all the forward visioning stuff and all that sort of stuff right in the front. That way, you know how it is when you have a 2-hour, 3-hour meeting, you get a bit tired in the end, and that's generally when you start thinking about that visionary stuff and that moving the organization forward. So there's little things like that, but also breaking down what is really the role of the chair. Really the role of the chair is just to chair the meetings, that everyone else is responsible for the organisation. You have the same fiduciary obligation. So breaking down those things that the chair, they do everything and they should be the be all and end all and the font of knowledge and those sort of things, I think we'll start shifting the paradigm. And look, it is difficult because we are all volunteers and we don't get paid. And that is a little bit of a something again that we should look at. I did some research for another project I'm doing, and what was interesting was the research was saying, no, don't pay not-for-profit boards. And look, in my mind, I think that's not quite right. Because if you want leadership, you actually have to pay for the time. And the leadership I'm talking about is not waving the wand and letting staff do the work, because as we know, in us little organisations, the two staffers, the one staffer, we're all in this together, so we all have to do the work. Yeah, I'll leave my opening gambit there, but there's a whole heap of things I think we can change. But we have to want to change, and we have to think about how we can change it.
So important to start to have those conversations about the way boards operate, the way they think into what leadership looks like. Something we've been doing with our own board recently, and something talking with a colleague, Kate Cherrington, around host leadership and what it means to share leadership around the board table. I think it's a really interesting concept to consider rather than more traditional models. Caren, can I come back to you?
Sure. So, and carrying on from Eynon's theme, I think there's an opportunity here for us as a creative sector to collectively agree that if we're all going to flourish in the future, then having really strong governance, leadership through governance, is really important. So actually valuing governance, because my sense is that actually our poor governors don't really get valued until things go wrong. And of course, with the buck stopping with them, everybody looks to them. I also think, and this is a little bit like the cool kids versus the geeky kids, right? That, you know, cool creatives saying, we just want to get on and do our creative work. We don't want to be bothered with all of that other C compliance stuff. You know, leave that to other people. But the reality is we can only all be successful if we're combining those things together and seeing them all as being valuable. So I think there's a conversation and a realization for us as a sector that creative organisations need great leadership through governance, and great leadership through governance needs great creatives. So we've got a mutual interest in this space that we need to all commit to. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say, coming back to some of mine and Eynon's earlier comments, is that there needs to be a realization that there's a whole lot to be gained through looking at different models and different approaches to governance. I'm really pleased to have my friend and colleague Guy Beatson from the Institute of Directors on the call today, because we're having these conversations with IOD, and we know IOD is seen as the kind of the bastion of you know, current governance practice. But I know that Guy and KP and their crew, they're up for new ideas as to what can better governance look like in this country. So we've got a huge opportunity as a sector to say, here's what great governance looks like for us. Like everything though, and I'm taking some lessons from what's happened in the community governance space. So kia ora Rose from community governance, where the community governance sector said, look, we know that governance needs to get better, but we've all got to do our bit and make a contribution. And over what's been a relatively short period of time, the not-for-profit sector has pulled together, has started to develop practice, standards, the latest good governance code. And this is all pretty much based on people's largely voluntary effort, and then now the trust forming. And it gives me some real optimism that with a really good movement, things can be changed.
Kia ora, Caren, and thank you for mentioning the Community Governance Code. It's great to see that emerge from the sector as a bottom-up approach to value and principle-based leadership and governance. So thinking about some of the conversations that we had last year, and some of you in the room may have been involved in some of these, and I know, Rosabelle, we're going to come to you in a couple of minutes to share some of your reflections. What were the things that you heard in those conversations, or that you're hearing from people in the sector and the boards that you're on around maybe things that are specific to this sector. You know, this is an incredibly diverse ecosystem that we all belong to, and thinking about what practice in the creative sector, what are people feeling that they need, what are the issues, what are the ideas that you're hearing? Caren, if I come back to you first, is that okay?
Yes, sure, but I might do the old hospital pass thing and throw it out to Rosabel, and thinking about some of those conversations that we were having during the workshops, and anybody else who was on those workshops, because there were some really great conversations. So Rosabel, anything that you would like to add?
Thanks, Caren. Apologies to everyone as well, because I actually have to leave shortly after this. I have to join another hui at 10. But I think what really came through in those earlier hui that we had was really the hunger from a lot of people who were there to transform the way we do things, and then the challenge and how you bring the rest of the board and the organization along with you as well. And that work of actually shifting really fundamentally the way that we do things. And I was just thinking about it this morning. I think we're also talking about shifting from a more transactional notion of what boards are set up to do. There's that old model of the board where it's, you know, we have to have a lawyer and an accountant and people who can give us money and help us fundraise. And that is a real one-way kind of idea of how boards can govern. Whereas if we're talking about boards which are leaders, as Eynon talked about, and that are driving towards a vision in collaboration with the leadership on an organization, it's a really big shift.
Yeah, and that whole notion of the changing and valuing of a board is huge, I think. And it's interesting that when people are looking for board members, right, there's an automatic default to those technical skills, right, as you said. And I can say this as an accountant, and many times that's why I've been asked to come onto a board. But we all know that boards rise and fall on their ability to have really strong relationships together and with their stakeholders in order to lead the conversation. And yet I don't think I've ever been judged or been sought out for my, interpersonal relationship skills, which really for me is what makes a difference at the board table, probably more so than my accounting skills or governance experience. So again, I think there needs to be a reframing of what makes a good governor, because as you say, those old paradigms don't always work. And this is not diminishing the responsibility of being compliant and being a robust organisation, not at all. This is about increasing the valuing of the other things that sit around it, the great board culture, great leadership, great relationships, which do make a huge difference.
Eynon, do you want to jump in?
I might say ditto.
We talked about that.
Yeah, and I guess it's always and. I think you're right. We default to the lawyers and the accountants, but what helps us grow our creative sector? And I think those are the questions we need to start posing when we're looking for trustees, is about what's going to, who is going to have the most effect on whatever our organisation is. And it's, I think like Roosevelt said, it's not actually, it is hard, it's not easy. And because most people have either done the director's course or follow that sort of model, that's the model that always comes to the forefront. It doesn't matter if you're looking at a separate model, actually it's still based on that same sort of paradigm. So it's a cultural shift as well. I think getting boards that reflect our community and our sector, that helps as well. When you get diverse thinking, you actually get growth. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think, Alison, though, one of the other things is that, and this could apply to our sector and many others, is that there are some real myths and legends around governance, what it should look like and what good governance looks like, that people automatically default to. So for example, that you have to be older to be of any use because you had to have amassed sort of really great management experience. And hey, at the age of 55, I wish I knew half of the things that 26-year-olds know these days, because I would feel better armed up for the future ahead, right? And so how do we value those sorts of skills? Because it's so easy to default to, let's get a young person on a board, but they really need looking after and they need a buddy, and we won't let them vote. And so, oh my gosh, why even have them there when there's so much more we could be learning from them? So I think there's got to be some real changes and attitudes around what makes a great governor. And in our creative sector, being able to, realize and value creative leadership and thinking about how that can impact on the governance role and governance decisions. So we had this great conversation about, when if you're a theatre company and if you're wanting to put on a play and you think about the cast as a whole, right? How does that change your approach to recruiting great governors? We tend to look for individuals with certain sets of skills. And I know this is difficult to do, but would it be totally different if we looked for a team of people and thought about it that way, thought about the whole cast rather than just the leading lady and the leading man? These are some of the things I'm really excited to have conversations about. And I guess the challenge today, which is why I'm so thrilled to see so many people here, is what is the sector up for and what contribution are people willing to make in order for our whole sector to move? Because it's fabulous that Alison and Kylie and their crew at Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi have made this space, but we can't expect them to drive it for the whole sector, right? So what do we do as individual organisations? And lastly, I'd say, Eynon, I sit on boards that are paid roles, right? And there are still issues. So there are still issues around how do we make sure that we have great relationships at the board table that really do focus on the interests of the organisation and keep that at heart.
Cool. I think this is a great conversation, and I'm conscious that people will have questions, and I know people are popping questions in the chat. So I might give you a moment, Caren, to have a look at some of those questions popping up in the chat. And we'll wrap up this part and then we'll go into a bit more of a wider discussion. It's quite tricky on a webinar to have people actually asking the questions in person. So what we'll do is, if you could use the chat, then we'll try and respond to a few of them now and see what's emerging for people. Thank you already for sharing all your great ideas and thoughts and messages of support and offers of what you already do. I guess one of the things that we're looking at here, because I'm really conscious that governance and leadership generally in the creative sector and ecosystem is often very poorly resourced. Not only are board members often volunteers, there's very little development opportunity that's affordable or even necessarily appropriate for the sorts of things that we're starting to talk about and explore today. So one of our questions, I guess, back out to the sector is what could be helpful that doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money or, involve formal training, no offense IOD, or community governance, because those are important mechanisms, but they're not accessible for everybody, and they're not necessarily going to have at the moment the right mix of things for the scale. I think, correct me Kylie, but I think even when we were looking on the charitable register to invite everybody today, we got to something like over 600 trustees just in Tamaki Makaurau involved in registered charitable sort of arts and creative organisations. Is that right, Kylie? You're smiling at me, yeah. And that's definitely not everybody. So, the scale of this sector, and no doubt people here in this room today and out in the sector will also have multiple roles. They're probably on multiple boards. And so, this is a vast sort of opportunity for some good conversations, but I'm interested in what support and ideas people have, what support people need and what ideas they might have. So Caren, I might jump back to you and Eynon as well. If there are questions that you're seeing pop up or thoughts that you've had, we're interested in sort of opening up the conversation a little bit more now.
Yeah, sure thing. I'm wanting to pick up just something that I saw Sam Jukes put into the chat, because I think if we start, you know, to quote Julie Andrews at the very beginning, thinking about how we recruit people onto boards and how we arm people up to be good governors, because I don't know about you, but you know, I've learned on the job for the beginning time of my career. I kind of learned by doing it, and then realized the things that I didn't know, went off and got some training, etc. And I think that's kind of the go for most people, right? So are there ways that we can better arm up people before they even take on the roles or decide to take on the roles? Bearing in mind that, and there's some really interesting conversation in the chat about who is able to put their hands up for governance, right? So we know lots of people who are retired have the time and the headspace to be able to put into boards. So there's one group of people. But back to my conversations earlier on about how do we get younger people, most of them have got full-time jobs or are studying. And so their ability to contribute is kind of lessened. So how do we create an environment where it makes it easier for people to put some time into governance, and a whole lot of different people? But I'm just searching through for Sam's, well, actually, instead of searching through, Sam, shall I just get you to say it rather than reading it out?
Hello.
Thanks, go for it.
Yes, I'm just trying to remember what I said now. I guess one thing I'm aware of when I am, you know, putting forward my bio for being recruited for a board, so for the recent Women in Film and Television elections, is what I'm saying in my, I have to sort of present a platform, something I'll be campaigning for in order to be compelling to the people voting. And there are things I specifically want to achieve. But actually what I think I contribute more than anything else is everyday steerage, really good process, really good critical analysis of everything that's going on, keeping across the issues, getting informed when, you know, certainly when that's needed, unless we've got set specialists on it, forming a view, sharing a view, making sure we've got an action plan. That's not being assessed anywhere by our voters, or their reading is that I want to help parents stay engaged with the industry, and you know, and what my background is. But there are plenty of people who have sat on lots of boards and may have achieved nothing at all on those boards, to be brutal. So I wonder how we can help people recruit people who will be effective. And one off the cuff thought on how we can both achieve that, but also improve governance and also give something back to the people volunteering their time, was sorry about the background noise, is providing some kind of course or certification, so that when people are going for the role, they can feel more confident to do that, but also when they're sitting around the table and they're looking at a profit and loss, rather than feeling too scared to even process it, they could actually identify what their questions are and ask those questions, and they could be more effective in all of the everyday little hassles and glitches that come up. And then that certification is something that they can take forward. They might get on paid boards in the future. It's something they can put on their CV. So it's a little bit of giving back as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, because also it starts to lift the valuing of the governance role, right? People can start to recognise and have kind of some consistent standards that are realistic about what it takes to be a really good governor. So I really like that idea, and Alison and Kylie, just something we could put on our list to think about in terms of where from here. Can I throw it over to just to Faith, because I'm looking at your question in the chat, and it would be good to get other people's views as well about chairing a very young board at the ripe old age of 32, old to be 32 again. But actually, again, rather than reading it out, Faith, can I just get you to just share it with the group?
Oh yeah, I guess I'm the acting chair of the Samoa House Library Board, that I think is only a couple of years old. I got brought on this year. And I guess what we're struggling with is time. You know, everyone's really enthusiastic, we have ideas, but there's kind of a collective inexperience, especially, you know, in terms of like treasury, I don't know, accounting, all that kind of stuff, the kind of the funding knowledge. And two of the people who kind of started the board who've been there since the beginning are leaving soon, and I'm just really worried about how the board will now support the 2 staff members that we have. And yeah, I guess I just feel that we are very green, and I guess I'm keen to know how we can kind of be more sustainable and kind of make it yeah, I don't know, I'm just recovering from COVID, so my brain is like really not working properly, but yeah, I guess I'm just keen to do better stuff, and I don't know how to do it.
Can I jump in quickly, and then I'll stop taking up all the oxygen and pass to Eynon? But you know, this is, I think, a question for us in the sector, right? So how do we support each other? Because we all kind of go through the same waves in terms of our governance strengths, governance issues, governance practices. And between us, we must have amassed a pretty huge basket of knowledge, both of what to do and certainly what not to do. And it just strikes me that we don't sort of have a landing place to bring that all to be able to share, to say, hey, if you're at this stage in your board, here's some things that you might think about. And so whether or not there's a, and you know, this is where, again, I'm coming back to the community governance movement, where they're providing that space really for the not-for-profit boards. Is there something we can do in the creative sector to provide that? So when people like Faith have those questions about what are good approaches, processes, things that we should be thinking about at this stage, there's some resource to go to. But I'll pass over to you, Eynon.
I just want to step back a little bit, and that's a great question, Faith. And I think that there was another point in the chat about peer mentoring from organisations, and that makes sense as well. Generally, to get on a board in our sort of sector, it's a popularity contest if you're a trust, because you know the number of people that turn up, they vote and you put your hand up, or however you do your voting process. Now, I think we've got to step back and say, is that the best way to form a leadership group to take our organisation going forward? We have to start having those conversations about what's the best model for our organisation to work in. I know of our model where the person that is currently the general manager, I suppose, basically selects the board members based on the skills that they need around the table. Now, is that a better model? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying that we have to start thinking about it rather than just having a popularity contest. So before we even get into that situation, we should be actually thinking about how we can sort of support, I guess, the board process before we even get to putting the trustees on. And then we've got the situation we are with Faith now, that actually if the older trustees, and I'm talking old more in terms of being there longer, leave, then you've lost a whole lot of history and knowledge that will sometimes takes years to build up. So yeah, I think if we're going to have a conversation, we have to have a conversation about the whole gambit rather than just about how to be a good trustee. It's actually the step further. What is the actual process to get on the board, and you know, is putting your CV in and having a competition against 10 other people, is that a good way of doing it? Personally, I don't think it is. And the other thing is that I haven't got the right way of doing it either. But I think we need to have the conversation about it.
Hey, I'm just wondering if we can go to Kat, because I'm reading the kind of conversation in the chat about a suggestion there. So, morena, Kat.
Morena koutou. Oh yeah, I was just hearing what people were talking about in terms of, I think Alison was referring to the need for training and upskilling, but that can be an inaccessible and expensive exercise, and not everybody can afford to do something like that. So something that came to mind was just an open door policy for boards to kind of who feel that they are well established and have something to offer, where they just have their door open for a couple of meetings a year for anyone who might want to sit and observe. And I think that I was thinking about that approach because when I think about what's successful about my board and what I find so inspiring about the way that they operate is not necessarily the skills that everybody brings, but the atmosphere that they create in the room for really rigorous and courageous conversation to unfold. And just that kind of, it's almost like board meetings feel like a creative process in itself, and that it's explorative and everybody's kind of looking for, I don't know, that kind of collective design thinking way into the conversations that come up. So yeah, kia ora.
Got a cat. I think that's a fantastic idea, and I think there's some amazing ideas coming up in the chat, and I encourage you to keep, bringing ideas and offers and suggestions in, because we're definitely interested in hearing what people are thinking to see what we could do to support, but also so that you can reach out and support each other as well. I think there's something very important about that sort of Tuakana Taina model, about peer mentoring, about how do we work to be a network of people interested in this space, working in this space, looking at what people are doing that they've experienced, in their own practice that's worked, as well as what hasn't worked. Things definitely not to do can be just as important as things to try to help shape the conversation. There's lots of lovely ideas popping up here. We're doing okay for time, so we've got time for a couple more questions, and then we'll move into the where to from here. Caren or Eynon, do you have a couple of other things that you'd like to respond to in the chat, particular things that have piqued your interest? Or
actually one, and sorry, it's coming back to you again, Kat, and thinking about that environment that's at your board table, and that's the kind of thing that we've been talking about would be awesome. Is there anything in particular about your recruitment processes? Because we've been talking quite a bit in the chat about how do you recruit, how do you get the right people? Is there anything that you would say in the recruitment processes that you use at the basement that's really helped you have that environment as a board?
Yeah, absolutely. My board chair is also here too. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. So Wendy, if you want to pipe in after me, please do. I think what you said about the ensemble is an amazing way into recruitment, because definitely I used to sit on the board before I was the ED, and even back then there was always a consideration for the incoming person as a whānau member and how they would kind of bounce and bump against the existing members, and that kind of holistic look at things of not necessarily the skills but the who they are as a person, and what their values are as a human, and how that aligns with the kaupapa of basement, and whether or not that person has a deep personal alignment, really. But definitely that ensemble thinking is so awesome. Caren, thank you for kind of articulating it like that for me, because that is a creative that really clicked in, and I think that's kind of what we do at basement. Wendy, would you like to jump in?
Sure, thanks, Kat. Look, I totally agree. I think the ensemble idea is a really nice way to put it. I think it's also thinking about board recruitment more as values-based rather than skills-based. So it's tricky to move away from that, accountant, lawyer kind of approach to creating a board. But I think it's like Kat said, it's about does this person align with basement's kaupapa? Does this person align with basement's values? Can this person be a voice at the table? But it's also about
enabling people to do that. So something we have done at Basement for the last few years is we've had kind of a youth trustee kind of role. Karen's comments earlier just challenged me to think a bit about what that role looks like in terms of, does that person vote, what's their contribution, but something that we realized with that role is that person doesn't necessarily have the same resources as other trustees to attend meetings, so to get transport to meetings, to give up that time from their part-time job that they do while studying. And so how can we remunerate them or support them to do that? So I think thinking about, in terms of recruitment, thinking about a person's values, but also thinking about how as a board and an organisation you can enable that person to fully contribute to the best of their ability.
Thank you, Kat and Wendy. That was really insightful. And I think there's lots of fantastic ideas here around what sort of support people need to be involved in governance, both in terms of development and learning opportunities, but resourcing as well. And to Eynon's point earlier, and I would definitely agree with this. I think unless it is excluded, which unfortunately in our trust it is, and I've done my best to try and remove it, unless it's excluded that you can pay people, I would really encourage you to think about something, a contribution, I do think it helps. It's not the driver, and a lot of people will say they don't need it, but for those that do, our philosophy at Te Taumata is if you're unwaged, then you're supported to participate, just as people who are waged in their jobs can be participating. So I think those are the sorts of values and principles that I'd encourage everyone to look at. Some amazing ideas about people sitting on multiple boards or swapping, board to board, which also brings connections across the sector and greater understanding of what's going on at Q or what's going on at Basement or what's going on at Te Po. I think those are great opportunities to look for. And the other thing I just wanted to comment on was the conversation about building your ensemble, your team, thinking about the whole is so important. We've recruited more than half our board and new trustees in the last 2 years at Te Taumata with a very deliberate approach to building the overall team and culture of the organisation, which has had some incredible, very long-standing trustees who'd been there forever. And, we've been very deliberate and thoughtful in that and recruiting aligned to values and strategic intent. Because if you're a trust that's already been on a journey of direction, looking at your direction and where you want to go, then you're thinking, have we got all the skills we need in our whole organisation? Thinking of the whole in terms of staff, volunteers, associate, board as a whole, a collective, and then where the mix is and what roles and contributions people can make. These are all really fantastic ideas. We are now at 10:20, and I'm conscious that we have about 10 minutes before we were very clear that we wanted to make this an hour. I'm sure we could talk all day about this stuff, but this is the beginning of a conversation. So I just want to again encourage you, any further questions, and start to perhaps add any more reflections. I think both have been coming up throughout the chat during this session. And while you're doing that, and we will capture all of this and we'll write something up as well. We also thought we might do a Q&A type thing afterwards and actually produce some, some suggested ideas and responses and links back to everybody in response to the questions that you're sharing so openly, which is fantastic. But just perhaps I'm going to come back to Eynon and Caren for some final reflections on this conversation, and then I'm going to share a bit about what we're hoping to do next before we wrap up our hui today. So Eynon, I'm going to come to you first. Just did you have any final things you'd love to share, reflections on the conversation?
I'd say ditto, can I? So,
no.
Look, I think, like you said, I think this is the beginning of a conversation, and everyone on this Zoom obviously wants to be part of change, or you wouldn't be here. And it's those little things that we can change that can make a big difference. For instance, the board that I chair, each meeting, each trustee takes a turn at chairing the meetings. One, it's a professional development thing, but actually there's 3 of those board members that can chair a meeting way better than I can. So, lean on and on their skills get you to get the trust moving and you're further along down the track. So those little changes at our little level could actually have a big effect down the track. I just wanted to mention one other thing that sort of that was someone might have mentioned it earlier on, and that's and I guess it is difficult to get younger people on boards, but the mātauranga that they bring really enhances. Well, it did our board anyhow, and we had a couple of young ones come on, and you're right, then they start having families and then the time commitment gets too much. So it's actually trying to utilise them while they're there. And that goes with anyone that's got a skill, that try and utilise that for the best of the trust while they're there. And they may be the accountant, but actually Caren's better skill is weaving people together. So, you know, find out what those skills are and then make sure that whatever focus on the board is, that person that has the best skill in that is actually the one that does the business. So it doesn't have to be the chair that goes out to meet all the sponsors or to go to CC&Z. Actually, who's got the best skill and work that out. So yeah, I'll leave it there. It's we could, like you said, we could go on forever.
Kia ora, Eynon. I love that. It's like the stepping in to do where you've got your strength and your thing to bring to the table, and then stepping back. I think it's as a non-dancer, you know, or not since the 80s anyway, the the sort of movement, I think, and the flow, I think, is just so important. And these are this stuff, I think this comes back to what are those creative skills that we've got, and how do we know what it is that we bring our whole selves when we come into something, and when to step forward and when to step back and when to share the load and when to work together on things, and the art of delegation, which Eynon's an expert at. I think that's really important as well. Caren, I'll just come back to you for some closing thoughts. I know you're not feeling very well, so hang in there.
So ditto, and really interesting you're picking up a dance theme, right? Because that's sort of my space as a dance tutor, particularly in the Cook Island space. And I think about some of those skills that I often bring to the board table, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And that's partly because as a Cook Islander, there are things for me that I'm going to use in every space, regardless of what the space is. But those things don't always get recognised. So I think I agree on your point, Alison, that there's a real opportunity here for boards to get better at extracting what are the best skills that are going to be the most useful at the board table for this season and this time in the life of the board. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to pick up on Hamish Coney's chat post there about a mentoring register. And so thanks for the suggestion for Creative New Zealand to pick that up. And so I'm just going to put my CNZ hat on for 3 seconds, because that's not the hat I'm wearing here, to say it's certainly worth a conversation. But of course, what this really highlights is that we don't have a central point for the creative sector. And I know by default, often it's seen as CNZ, but we don't have contact to everyone. Not everybody comes to us for funding, and there isn't really a logical central place. And that is one of the things for us, right? So I think for those of you here in the, at least those of you here in the Auckland area, have got a bit of a central focus point with Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi, and perhaps you start there. So yes, Alison and crew, I'm thinking here's another job that's possible. But I think that's a really great idea. I know that one of the things I know about the creative sector is people are really generous in terms of their time and their support. And we already see that, and that's something that could be really useful in terms of strengthening our governance. So thanks for that, Hamish.
Kia ora, Caren. Thank you. Yeah, look, we're really happy to take on board ideas and filter and see what we can do to support in our role as a sort of backbone organisation to help the sector. I can't promise that we can do everything, but we're certainly really, really keen on this space, and and there's some simple things that could be done as well. So we're definitely interested in your ideas, and there's been some fantastic ideas already this morning. So that brings me to a little bit of a closing session. So I would just like to share with you what we would like to do next, and then I'm going to hand back to Eynon to close our hui. First of all, just thank you again, Eynon and Caren, for your sharing your wisdom, Rosabelle, for everybody who's contributed. This has been incredible, and I know it sounds like a weird thing to be excited about, but this really excites me because I feel like we don't pay enough attention to this space, and it's something I'm personally really passionate about. I'm a director on boards myself, and I've had really great experiences and really terrible experiences, both working with and for boards, so, and on them. So, you know, I really feel like this is a space where we can create a stronger community of practice, and that's really what we would like to do next. So following on from today, we put this out there, we shared some ideas based on the conversations that many of you contributed to earlier in the year. And today was a bit of a landing place to start the next phase. So what we would like to do from here is invite anyone who's interested to start being part of a community of practice around creative governance. We're thinking that the next hui in the new year might be, I think Kylie called it a bring a plate, although with COVID it might be a virtual plate. And to actually have a bit more, jump into some of the ideas that have emerged today and have a bit of a co-design. And then we would like to actually, Caren has kindly agreed to keep walking alongside us with this mahi, and Eynon will of course as well, and I'm just volunteering him, and and maybe host a series of community of practice conversations next year. So we're looking at maybe 3 or 4 sessions starting in February, where we can actually dive into some of these ideas and provide a space where people can come and share their thinking and support each other, and maybe do some more learning and some more work on creating good resources and ideas and tools and support for the sector. I hope it doesn't end there either, but that's our next phase of development. So if you're interested, please let us know. Kylie, who leads this initiative for Te Taumata, will be in touch with everybody and checking who's interested. And we'll see where that takes us. But it certainly seems like from today's response and the conversation, the fact that you all showed up when the football was on is, you know, a really good start, and it fills me with joy. And I think I'm just gonna look at you, Kylie. Is there anything else I meant to have said or done? No? Oh, look at that. I did my job okay. It's so lovely to see you all, familiar faces and new faces. I hope this has inspired you to think about already what you're doing with your own boards and your networks, and you don't have to wait for us to go out there and change the world. So keep doing the good work, and we will be back in touch to offer more opportunities to come together and build on today's foundation. So thank you all, and we look forward to continuing to connect with you. And I'm going to hand back to Eynon to close our hui for today. Thank you, Eynon.
Oh, tēnā tātou, hey, awesome kōrero, and a lot of the contribution in the chat was amazing. Just before I do close in karakia, there's a whakatauki. It sort of gets overused now, but in this context, I think it's quite right. And it says, "Kua tawhiti ke tō mātou haerenga mai ki te kore e hare tonu. He nui rawa o mahi ki te kore e mahi tonu." And this is what Sir James Henare said to the Māori battalion when they come back from the Second World War, and they were going back to their homes, their villages in those days, and it was about nation building, that we've come too far not to go further, and he's talking about the struggles overseas and why they went to war, and they've done too much not to do more. And I think this is fitting in our kōrero today, is that we've only started scratching the surface, but we have to go further and we have to do more. Otherwise, we're going to get the same old, and we'll be having the same conversations in 30 years' time. Well, I don't think I'll have here by then, but whatever time it is. So I'll just close us up with a karakia. I'm wishing everyone a good day today. Me noi tātou. Let us pray. A tēnei rā, te mauri nui tēnei rā, te mauri roa. Te mauri ka whakapiki, te mauri ka whakakake. Te mauri o enei tohunga, te mauri o tēnei tauira. Te mauri ki runga, te mauri ki raro, te mauri ka aputa ki te whai au ki te ao mārama. Auhi, wero, tawana mai te mauri. Haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. Kia ora everyone. Have a great day.